Hello friends! So, I was trying to think of a way of describing the sort of culture that I am most attracted to, and here is what I came up with. Middle class. But what is the middle class, you ask? And why do I love it so much? Well, let us do a deep dive. For most of human history, there were basically only two classes, the very rich and the very poor. This is because the economic system was very simple and there weren't a lot of jobs other than landowner and serf. But then, over the centuries, we went through a number of economic and technological changes, creating a whole bunch of new jobs right in the middle of the income spectrum, which allowed a new sort of lifestyle to emerge, the lifestyle of the middle class. And over the last century or so, the middle class grew huge and basically squeezed the other two classes to the fringe. The middle class has now grown so big, it has actually developed new classes within itself, like the lower middle class and the upper middle class, as distinguished from what is sometimes called the comfortable middle class. I personally grew up in a very comfortable Canadian middle class family, possibly even upper middle. My parents both went to college and had very solid middle class careers. My mother was a high school teacher, while my father was a bureaucrat for the federal government. They had two kids, my sister and me, and we all lived together in the suburbs of Vancouver in a nice house with 4 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. All my school friends when I was growing up had parents just like me and lived in houses just like mine, meaning I basically never left the middle class bubble. I never knew any poor people, or for that matter, any really rich people. Only families of slight gradation within the middle class spectrum. So, what are middle class people like? Well, there are a few broad themes that define middle class existence, including consumerism, conformism, and anxiety. These might sound like very bad things, and they are certainly the aspects of middle class life that a lot of people like to judge. But when you look at these things from a more objective perspective, I think there is a lot of good stuff to be found in them as well. Consumerism basically just describes the idea of having enough money to spend on the small luxuries of daily life and deriving a lot of pleasure and identity from them. So the idea would be that while the rich derive a lot of their pleasure and identity from super expensive stuff like fine art or giant houses, the middle class derives equal pleasure from stuff they can buy at the mall or supermarket. For example, when I was a kid, I was really into stuff like video games and action figures and candy, which my parents could buy for me because they had enough money left over from servicing the family's basic needs for food and shelter. This is basically the essence of middle class economics. My possessions were a big part of how I related to other people. They were what I talked about the most with my friends and what I had the most passionate opinions on. And it wasn't just kids either. I grew up in the 1990s, which was sort of a peak age of middle-class culture wars over competing consumer brands. Everyone was either Nintendo or Sega, or Pepsi or Coke, or Mac or PC. It was fun. Consumer culture also plays a big role in how the middle class celebrates holidays or enjoys vacations. What were your favorite types of candy to eat at Christmas? What sort of restaurants would you like to go to when you visited a different city? All of this, incidentally, is why I really love to get stuff in the mail from you guys. Since I grew up in a very consumer culture, seeing the consumer objects of other places is an easy way for me to learn from and relate to them. If I was rich, things like sports jerseys or seasoning cans would mean nothing to me, because I wouldn't have grown up in a culture that taught me to find value in things like this. And if I was poor, well, I wouldn't be making YouTube videos. Conformism relates to the idea of wanting to be like the people around you and having very clear standards for the way things should be. So middle class world tends to be one where the people have a lot of the same basic hopes and dreams, like going to college and getting a good middle class job so you can afford to buy a house out in the suburbs, just like the one your parents had. Somewhat paradoxically, this conformism with a certain expected lifestyle is also seen as a real demonstration of independence. The defining struggle of the middle class is securing the freedom to live the kind of life that they want. And it just so happens that the stereotypical middle class lifestyle is the one that is most conducive to freedom. Owning your own house means being free of landlords, having a good job means being free from painful or degrading labor, and making good money means being free to buy the consumer goods that give you pleasure. So that creates a lot of pressure for everyone to follow the exact same path. I mean, you want your freedom, don't you? Consumer culture also tends to foster a lot of conformism in terms of taste. When you have a lot of people living in close proximity to one another who all have the same amount of money and watch the same advertisements and shop at the same stores, surprise, surprise, they tend to buy a lot of the same stuff. This is part of the reason why it is so easy to foster a sense of middle-class community around things, like I said before. For example, think about all of those sentimental list articles you see on BuzzFeed. 29 things all 90s kids had in their parents' house growing up. These sorts of things work because they very skillfully exploit the high degree of conformity among their readers. But of course, middle-class people do also find the conformist nature of middle-class life to be somewhat smothering, which is why various forms of mild rebellion are also a very big part of middle-class culture. Things like being a goth or an atheist or doing something weird with your hair are all examples of middle-class rebellion that show the tension between conformity and independence. The next big thing is anxiety. One thing that the rich and the poor have in common is not caring too much about what other people think of them. The poor, by definition, spend a lot of time just struggling to get by, while the rich are off in their own world doing whatever crazy thing they want. The middle class, however, have a unique anxiety that comes with being between these two extremes. Their existence is defined by a constant struggle to A, not fall into poverty, and B, seem wealthier than they actually are. The point I really want to press, however, is that it is not just about money. Middle-class people are big into the idea that wealth and poverty are states of mind born from habits and character. Therefore, one of the keys to life is learning the good values and avoiding the bad ones. My parents were very strict in a very stereotypically middle-class way when I was growing up. They were always very worried that our family would do things that would look lower class, so they could be quite bossy about what my sister and I should and shouldn't do. This could involve stuff like how we behaved at the dinner table, or what sort of TV shows we watched, or who our friends were, or even what sort of cereal we ate. The rule was always that our family should embrace high standards because that was what this imagined higher class of respectable people did. My mother in particular would often say things like, "Do you think that they eat with their mouth open when they're dining at the White House?" This sort of middle class social anxiety manifests in all sorts of other ways too, like take politics. Middle class people are sort of pulled in both directions when it comes to politics. There's obviously a conservatism inherent in being middle class because conformism makes you very defensive about the status quo and very skeptical of radical changes to it. But at the same time, being too right-wing is associated with a kind of stupid poor person, so you don't want to be that either. But there is also a liberalism inherent in being middle class too. Middle class people are always looking to save money, so there is a lot of support for the idea that government should pay for, college tuition and healthcare and maternity leave and things like that. Those things are all very expensive, and we would prefer to spend our money on consumer goods. But at the same time, you never want to go too far in asking for government help, because then you would be on welfare. And welfare is like the middle class hell because it represents a complete loss of independence and respectability. So it might sound like I'm being sort of snide and sarcastic about all of this, but in all honesty, I really do like middle class culture. I think that the creation of a strong middle class is actually one of the great triumphs of humanity. Indeed, the reason why I love Canada and America so much is because I think these are the two countries of the world that really embody middle-class culture in such a pure and unapologetic form. Middle-class culture is easy to mock because it can look very fussy and insecure. It can also beg uncomfortable questions about what the purpose of life is, which is why Hollywood often makes movies like American Beauty or Edward Scissorhands that make middle-class life look kind of grotesque and soulless. Or why subverting symbols of the middle class have been such a rich target for artistic satire over the years. But there are honorable ways of framing the middle class too. Like, check out this interview of David Frum giving an interview with C-SPAN a while ago. In it, I think he makes a very eloquent case for a sort of middle class conservatism in the sort of small C sense of the word.
I have what you call bourgeoisie values written down so everybody knows what we're talking about. Thrift, diligence, sobriety, fidelity, procedure, and orderliness. Where do you get those? I mean, what is a bourgeoisie value? Who's a bourgeoisie?
Well, I think the idea is, these are sort of the once much mocked middle class values. That what they are a list of are sort of the small virtues of everyday life, not the grand heroic passions that opera composers write about, but the civic and familial virtues that make for the ordinarily decent person. And what conservatives worry about a lot is making sure that the ordinary person lives up to a certain standard of decency, and we don't set the standard of decency too high. We don't ask everybody to be a hero. That, I think, is a lot of the conservative critique of what's wrong with leftism and socialism. That by asking people to share all their belongings with everybody else, that you set a standard of morality that nobody can live up to. And that if we want a moral society, we have to give people moral requirements that are feasible.
These days, one of the big arguments in politics is that the middle class is dying. When a politician says things like this, she's usually talking in a purely financial sense, which is to say she's worried that people aren't making enough money, or that too much of their money is going to healthcare and taxes and whatnot, which is causing too many families to drift in this direction. And fair enough, perhaps that's true. But I also think that the middle class is dying to the extent people don't really appreciate what it is to be middle class, or the fact that middle class culture has a lot going for it. A lot of middle class people, particularly middle class young people, feel very alienated these days. They feel that their existence is really empty, or that they have nothing to be proud of. I personally think that one of the ways we can help combat this is by making the case for a certain sort of middle class pride, which is to say looking closely at the life you've lived and the things that that life is full of, and learning to appreciate those things as having some inherent worth. Not just things in terms of objects, although I do think that those matter, but also like, traditions and customs and just the sort of understandings that govern day-to-day life. We don't have to believe that these things have worth in comparison to some imagined heroic standard, but rather just be able to acknowledge that they are important to us, and that makes them precious and worth defending. But anyway, I suspect that most of you guys are middle class yourself, so I'd very much like to hear what you have to say about the whole middle class identity. What do you consider some of the defining qualities of middle class life? Which ones were pressed hardest on you as being really important when you were younger? And of course, if you do not come from a middle class background yourself, well, then I would be even more interested in hearing what middle classness means to you. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this weird little video essay of mine. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and please do continue to mail me beloved icons of middle class existence from your community. See you all next week.